But today I'm talking about something else. And yeah, I know these images are really gross, and I won't leave them up for too long, but I do want to make a point with them. My main subject today is a series of case histories that's been published every week in the New England Journal of Medicine since 1924. It's called the Case Records of the Massachusetts General Hospital. And Massachusetts General Hospital takes a long time to say. Everybody calls it MGH, so I'm going to call it MGH, and that's what that means when I say that. And before I talk about that, I'm going to talk about this series and tell you all about it. But first, I want to just explain. I have written a book, as Claudio mentioned, as Professor Sant mentioned, about case histories. My book about case histories in Galen, who was a doctor who wrote in the 2nd century CE. He wrote in Greek, and he lived under the Roman Empire. And he tells hundreds of stories about his patients in his work. And so by case history, I mean the kind of narrative story about a patient that doctors tell, usually when they're trying to illustrate a medical point. This is a very, very ancient genre. It's as old as medical writing and probably older. The Hippocratic Corpus, which is the oldest corpus of medical writing in Western medicine, and is, again, written in ancient Greek in the 5th century BCE, has a whole series of 8 books called the Epidemics, which is almost all case histories. So this is just an example of just one medical tradition that has case histories going back all the way to the beginning. And we see case histories in early Egyptian texts as well. There's a very prominent tradition of case histories in Chinese writing that arises a little bit later in the tradition and so on. But just to make the point that case histories are not a modern phenomenon. They are a modern phenomenon, but they have very ancient roots. So I wrote the book about Galen's case histories, and that is what is informing my analysis of the case histories in the NEJM. So if you look at your handout, does everybody have a handout? I'll just sort of explain what's on the handout so you can follow along. I know it's really, really long, but what it is, it's an example of a case history from Galen and a case history from the New England Journal of Medicine. And so what I'm kind of doing is comparing them, which I know is this kind of project I always tell my undergraduates not to do. But I think you'll see what I'm getting at with this comparison of these two stories. And of course, they're chosen pretty much at random, except that the one from Galen is kind of my favorite one, and the one from the NEJM, you'll see why I chose it when we get to the end of this story. All right, so let me talk a little bit about Galen's case histories, and then I'll talk about the NEJM case histories, and then I will compare them as I promised to do. So Galen's case histories are pretty unstructured and anecdotal, as you can see if you sort of look over that one. They're very self-aggrandizing. This is probably obvious from even the first lines of the story in your handout. They contain many subtle and not subtle morals and judgments. So they're pretty typical of case histories in that they're hard to use for historical analysis. They don't contain very many firm dates or facts or anything at all. For ancient case histories like Galen's, it's often really hard to tell what's factual and what's made up. So they're very hard to use for traditional kinds of history. It's a little easier to use them for social history by analyzing how the story's told. So that's what I've tried to do with Galen's stories, and that's what I'm going to do today as well. For example, how Galen presents the patient, how he describes his own arrival on the scene, how he characterizes the patient's other doctors, and so forth. That is, when we read case histories, if we think about how can we use case histories for history, it's not immediately obvious, but when we read them more like literature, we can get a lot out of them as historians, sort of paradoxically. In particular, the structuralist approaches that are sometimes used to analyze narrative in literature are especially fun to apply to case histories. I'm not going to go too much into methods today. I think my methods are pretty basic and will be pretty obvious as I'm talking. So I'm not going to address that too much unless you want me to later. So, as I've mentioned, the first item on your handout is an example of one of my favorite stories from Galen. I'll be referring to it throughout the talk, so you know, you can keep looking at it if you want to. This is a translation that I made a long time before there was an English translation of the work that this comes out of. It's Galen's masterwork on the method of healing, his epic takedown of the Methodist sect of medicine, which he detested, in 10 long books. And it's about 1,000 pages in English. And now there is a easily accessible English translation you can buy from the Loeb Classical Library of Harvard University Press if you want to. But this is my translation that I made years ago. Okay, so most historians of science know that case histories have always been important in Western medicine and in other medical traditions. But what we often appreciate less is how important they are today. I don't have time to address this question fully. There's some books I can recommend if you want, but instead I'm going to introduce you, as I said, to my favorite modern series of published case histories, and then I'm going to show what happens when we read them the same way that we read Galen's case histories, or the way that I read them for my book. So this is the case record series. This is not the case record series, but the case record series are the series that I'm going to talk about. It's the longest, most formal, and most rigorous of several types of case history that appear regularly in the New England Journal of Medicine. So there are other kinds, and these are what I'm illustrating here, of sort of diagnostic puzzle features in the NEJM that are basically case histories. And this is an example. They publish a lot of these image challenges or images in clinical medicine. They have them in print, and they have them on Facebook, and they put them online. These are probably the most popular features of the NEJM. And you can see they give you an image, and then they say, what is it? They give you a little background on the patient, and so on. They also have a fun game. I don't know if anybody's ever played it, but you go to their website and they have, what's the game called? It's called Clinical Problem Solving, and you go through and it's little quizzes and you see what questions you can get right and so on. But again, it's based on a real case history of a real patient. They also have a feature called Clinical Problem Solving. I'm sorry, this is the interactive medical case. And then the feature called Clinical Problem Solving is another series that substitutes once a month for the case records series. So Clinical Problem Solving has a little bit different structure, but they alternate with case record series. And I'm actually analyzing them both together for some purposes of this analysis because they sort of, as I say, they alternate with each other. Letters to the editor often contain case histories in the NEJM, and they're called so-called syndrome letters. Sometimes they're funny. Once in a while they'll publish a humorous one. But, so the NEJM is full of case histories, and it's not the only medical journal that is. Just to take another random example is the British Medical Journal. And these aren't random examples. These are top medical journals. Of the top 5, 4 of them have regular case history features. And the BMJ has an especially large number of them. So especially if you go toward the end of every issue where there's the section called Practice, usually has several of these features, and you can see there's different ones. The 10-minute consultation, the easily missed, which is often misdiagnosed cases. A patient's journey is a little bit different. They started this feature in 2004, I think, and it's a first-person account by a patient going through a chronic illness. A little bit different from what I'm talking about today, but anyway, they also have picture quizzes, very similar to the image challenge in the New England Journal of Medicine. So my point here is that the case history is not dead, despite the sort of idea that we don't use case histories anymore, that they're anecdotal, that we now have evidence-based medicine. Case histories are actually really alive and well and thriving in the top medical journals. Now, it's true that they're most the most important features of the journals, their original research papers, usually are not case histories. They're usually rigorously statistical. But case histories appear in the more pedagogical and more clinically oriented parts of the journals. And so that's roughly what they're doing in medical publications today. Is that sort of roughly, we get the message? Okay. And by the way, editors often apologize for doing this. The BMJ publishes an online database called, I think it's just called Case Reports of the British Medical Journal. It has 11,000 cases in it. And I remember when they first put it online, they had this long apology for why we're publishing a collection of case histories. It's very popular. You can subscribe to it, and then you can post ones, and you can read them, and so on. But so there's this feeling that, this sort of ambivalence about using case histories in modern medicine, and yet they're obviously important. Okay, now, like most of Galen's stories, most case histories in antiquity, The case record series is also a published version of oral events. That is, they're stories about things that were probably originally told, transmitted orally, and are eventually written down and published. So the case record series is the written, published version of the clinical pathological conferences at MGH. And a clinical pathological conference, I think they do like 2 or 3 of these usually in a month. And they are, the Mass General, by the way, is the teaching hospital for Harvard University. So they are, physicians and surgeons at Mass General are professors at Harvard University. So that's the situation. And in any case, in 1910, they started doing these clinical pathological conferences. And the person who invented them was Richard Cabot. They're sometimes called Cabot cases for that reason. That is the stories about the patients in the conferences. And the story is that he had a roommate who was in the law school, and the law school was doing this exciting new reform where they were doing the case history method, where they learn law by talking about actual cases. And he thought that looked like so much fun that he wanted to do it in medicine too. This is a completely legendary story. It's probably totally wrong. But in any case, that's the story of the invention of the clinical pathological conferences. So in the way they work today, and they've evolved over time, but the way they work today is reflected in the structure of the case records. Is they start with somebody on the staff at MGH introduces a patient who has been a recent patient at MGH. And then there is a radiologist comes on and they do a discussion of all the imaging. And then the discussant comes on, and the discussant is the main feature of the clinical pathological conference. Classically, the discussant is somebody, usually from another hospital, although they are actually very often from MGH, and usually who does not know the diagnosis of the patient. So when they do know the diagnosis, they always say that they know the diagnosis. But in the classical pattern, they don't know the diagnosis. And the game is, are they going to be able to guess, based on the information presented about this patient, what was wrong with the patient? Can they get the right diagnosis? And so classically, since 1910, since these CPCs were set up, there's that drama. Is the person going to get it? And then finally, the last person to speak is the pathologist. And the pathologist tells you what the laboratory results said. And the pathologist is, again, traditionally the person who has the answer, who pulls the, what does it say? Nancy Harris, the editor, says she, he or she, it's like they pull a diagnostic rabbit out of a hat, or a zebra. It's a little joke. But in any case, and this still, despite various changes to the CPCs, it's still, when the one I went to, the pathologist came on and they said, the pathologist, here's the person who has the answer in her pocket. So there's still that perception that the pathological report is the real answer. And so if you look at your story, for example, this diagnostic game results in 3 different diagnoses. The discussant gives his diagnosis, and what's the discussant's name? I can't remember what his name is here. Christian R. Olson gives his diagnosis on page 2025 of the story. And right above that, you see the clinical diagnosis. The clinical diagnosis is presented, is what the what the physicians who treated the patient suspected when they ordered the tests that will tell us what the patient actually has. So first we get the discussant's diagnosis, then the people who treated the patient give you their diagnosis, what they thought it was, and then we get the pathologist's diagnosis. So these stories usually have 3 diagnoses: the clinical diagnosis, the discussant's diagnosis, and at the end, the very end, the anatomical diagnosis, which is the pathologist's report. This story at the end has final diagnosis instead of anatomical diagnosis. And I think this reflects the fact that in this case, this is unusual, I think it reflects the fact that in this case, the pathology report would not have been conclusive. The diagnosis was made mostly on other factors. And that's actually a theme in this series, this very last, most recent set of case histories that I might or might not get to talk about. So anyway, that's the story of how the case reports happen and how they get published. Are there questions about that so far, like what a CPC is like or how it's set up? So, and anyway, that's the case records. This is the CPCs, and for this study, let's generously call it a study. I read the 52 1 year's worth of case records. So I read 52 case histories, and they were from, what is it, I think September 9th, September 4th, 2014 through August 27th, 2015. So what I'm going to say is based on 1 year's worth of these stories. Okay. I talked about recent changes to the CPCs, and I guess I should say a little bit more about this because some of this does come up. In 2003, the current editor, Nancy Harris, took over the series, and she immediately made some changes and published an editorial in which she explained these changes. She felt that the diagnostic puzzle format was obsolete. She thought that because of modern advances in laboratory science, there aren't enough suspenseful diagnoses to keep the series going. So she wanted to shift the emphasis to management cases. And I'll just talk briefly about the format of management cases because I am going to talk about just a couple of them. Oh, here's Cabot. Oh, and here's my favorite management case from last year. Okay. So she thought that the public was better served if we switched the emphasis from, again, thrilling diagnostic puzzles to issues where there were difficult management decisions to be made. In these cases, it's usually a physician who actually treated the patient is the discussant. It's not a blind discussant. There's no guessing game. Everybody knows the diagnosis. The diagnosis in this case is nail in eye. It was not a mystery. But the management decisions were very difficult. The imaging showed the nail touching the carotid artery, and they had to make very difficult decisions about how to remove it. So the whole discussion was about that. So there are the classic CPCs, which are diagnostic puzzles, and there are the management CPCs, which are more like this. And again, I want to emphasize that Nancy Harris's sort of vision for this was not really realized. She thought that laboratory tests had made the thrilling diagnosis obsolete, and she was a little bit wrong about this. The CPCs usually do sort of overwhelmingly emphasize these mysterious, catastrophic, cascading symptoms in relatively young people that are hard to guess and suspenseful. And they do management cases, but they're sort of the minority of cases in the CPCs. So as it turns out, this sort of optimism about laboratory tests being able to solve everything and shed light on all mysteries was a little bit overblown. At least that's the impression that we get from reading, for example, this last year's worth series of stories. So that a lot of the stories, a common theme in a lot of the stories was the limits of laboratory testing. That several of the discussants emphasized how important it is to have careful observation of patients and picking up diagnostic clues. And you get in several cases the laboratory results either were ambiguous or could not have been ordered without sort of knowing what you were looking for. So that was sort of a theme in this last series. I wanted to talk about it more. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to mention it. But one reason I bring it up is that the diagnostic puzzle is also a really important theme in a lot of ancient case histories. It is an ancient trope. And it's a very pervasive trope in Western literature, and it's the Sherlock Holmes trope and the House MD trope, this idea of the, guessing a diagnosis from careful deduction from clues. And a lot of Galen's stories are like that too. So this is a way in which there's continuity between, over the centuries, among case histories. Not all of Galen's case histories are like that, but a lot of them are. All right. Okay. So obviously the two kinds of case histories are really different, but I'm not, you can see how they're different. I'm going to focus on some things that are the same. I just mentioned one thing that's kind of the same, some of the theme of the diagnostic puzzle. But in the two stories that I presented to you, there are some other sort of similarities that I'm going to emphasize. And the first one is the relationship between the patient's identity and the patient's disease. And this is essentially a moral relationship and a moral theme. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Now let's look at Galen's patient first and see how the theme of identity is important there. Galen's patient is a male neoniskos. He calls him a neoniskos, which means a youth. The word youth, neoniskos in Greek, really means someone in the prime of life. You could still be a youth and be like in your late 30s in Galen, but it means it is the prime of life. It's the most sort of ideal time to be alive. We find out quite a lot about him in lines 20 to 44 of the story. His temperament is naturally hot and dry, typical of someone his age. Also typical of his age and temperament, he has a slender muscular build, intellectual industry, physical fitness. All of these factors, heating, drying factors, are exaggerated by travel, by worry, by insomnia, by hot weather, by a visit to the gymnasium, and especially a fight with other youths in the gymnasium. And so all of this overheating and drying causes the anomaly, the so-called anomalia, the sense of abnormality that the patient perceives, which eventually resolves into fever. So it's the cause of his disease. This Galen explains the cause of his disease, but clearly we get a very well-developed sense of who the patient is from this story. Galen calls the patient a gymnastic type, calling further attention to the issue of who the patient is, and especially his membership in the empire's leisure class, which is the class that has time for these naked exercises in the gymnasium that are so important to Greek identity in the Roman period. He makes no overt moral judgments on the patient, but most ancient readers would have picked up a complex moral subtext to the story. That is, Galen is indirectly valorizing this young, masculine, intellectually and physically educated patient, even as his fatal flaw, his irascible competitiveness, leads him into danger. So this is a sympathetic patient who may have contributed to his own illness, but only by virtue of flaws typical of his mostly admirable character. And by character, I mean to include everything that makes this patient who he is, not only his personality, but also his age, physical appearance, gender, temperament, and social status. So do we see how this character of the patient is really integrated into the story and really helps to explain, it really is the basis of what happens to the patient. Okay, it would be tempting to suggest that in modern times, microbiological explanations have substituted for this holistic approach to explaining disease. But if you think about it for more than a minute, you might realize that this is far from true, and it's not even true in the New England Journal of Medicine. One thing many of the case records share is that here too the diagnosis turns partly on the question of who the patient is, and who the patient is always really important to the story. And in the NEJM, there is an ideal patient the way that this youth is ideal in Galen. There is an equivalent in the NEJM, and I will talk about that equivalent before we're done. Okay. As one discussant puts it, quoting Sir William Osler, who's one of the founders of Johns Hopkins University, it is much more important to know what sort of patient has the disease than what sort of disease the patient has. So in the case records, this theme comes up under the rubric of risk factors or so-called social information. The case records always provide the patient's age and sex, which are included in the title of the case. Also, living situation, profession, habits like smoking, drinking, and drugs, travel and immigration history, and sometimes other items such as ancestry, pets, and history of sexual activity. This means that it's possible to get quite specific impressions of the patients as characters. For example, one patient is a professor, a native of New England, living in Vietnam with a wife and 2 young children. One is an elderly widow from South America who lives alone, enjoys gardening, and has no pets and no bad habits. One is a cute 7-year-old boy with good social skills. So patients, when you read these stories carefully, the patients often emerge as pretty rich characters. Most case records patients seem to be, the typical case record patient seems to be well-behaved, middle class, young or youngish, white, and socially well-adjusted. They are married or they are young people living with their parents. There are notable exceptions, and these exceptions usually play a role in the diagnosis or management discussion. That is, the way I read these stories, there's a normative patient, and then there's deviations from that norm. And the deviations are usually reflected in what's wrong with the patient. And so I'm going to illustrate that. So if that's obscure, hopefully you'll be convinced by the end of this talk. An unemployed single mother and methamphetamine addict, for example, has delusional parasitosis. She's hallucinating parasites on her skin because of her drug use. A homeless divorced ex-convict has tried to kill himself with antifreeze. An 87-year-old widower living alone has become confused about his medications and his hypothyroidism. So these are all more or less deviant characters whose problem is linked to the ways in which they deviate from the sort of normative patient. A Romanian has a hydatid cyst from a parasitic infection. You know as soon as you hear that he's Romanian that it's going to be a problem. And yes, he probably picked up this parasite in Romania. So, and in fact, this is the patient that inspired the quotation about what kind of patient has the disease. Altogether, 9 of the 52 patients are identified as having non-European ancestry or mixed ancestry, including 3 immigrants from the Dominican Republic. 2 patients are European immigrants, and 1 has Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. Besides this last patient, only 2 other patients are explicitly identified as white or European, but not as immigrants, and the remaining 38 patients are not identified by ancestry. It's my impression that most or all of the unidentified patients have white or European ancestry. That is, the case records give the impression that white European ancestry is the default setting, and is unlikely to be a problem because they don't mention it, right? It's not going to be one of the clues that you need to make the diagnosis. You see what I'm saying? Okay. It won't factor in the patient's illness unless someone is a recent immigrant from some scary place like Romania. Exotic ancestry is more likely to be relevant, as in the case of the South American immigrant with histoplasmosis, which she probably picked up either there or gardening in rural New England. Bad habits. So ancestry is a theme, right? Another theme, bad habits. Bad habits are also a part of how patients are defined, and they are the most obvious moral factors in the case records. Although they're not always crucial to the diagnosis, and I should say that a lot of these stories seem to try to make the point that you shouldn't assume that the patient's bad habits cause the disease. But it's always there in the background. That potential link is always there. For example, an asbestos removal worker who is also a longtime smoker turns out to have not lung cancer but pneumonic plague. Travel to exotic destinations is always suspicious behavior. For example, a graduate student picks up malaria in Uganda, and a newlywed contracts chikungunya virus on her honeymoon in the Turks and Caicos Islands. Not all dangers are exotic, however. Rural New England can be dangerous in summer, as I've already said, because of the many tick-borne illnesses endemic to that region. In one clinical problem-solving case, a young Midwestern man is thought to have picked up dengue fever in Mexico, but actually has measles acquired in Southern California. So this is a little bit of a play on the exotic travel, dangers of exotic travel theme that we pick up in this story. So there's a cautionary message. Exotic travel is dangerous, but places within the United States can also make you sick, especially Los Angeles, right? Okay. However, by far the most dangerous thing you can do in the case records is have sex. Patients suspected of having infectious diseases are usually interrogated on this subject and often disbelieved, especially if they are non-normative patients who don't conform to the ideal described. There seems to be a pretty close connection between their presumed sexuality and how closely they conform to being that normative patient. So I know that's obscure, so let me continue here. For example, one homeless man who says he is not sexually active is repeatedly tested for syphilis over a number of years before proving to have pellagra, a simple vitamin B6 deficiency. It's really kind of a tragic story. Another story explicitly cautions against believing what patients say about their sexual history. The patient is a 57-year-old divorced, HIV-positive man. See, he's divorced, he's HIV positive, right? And lifelong smoker who lives with a female partner. And when the patients are married, the case histories always say they're married. So when they say he lives with his female partner, they're not married. Right? He tells his doctors that he has not had sex in 2 years, and they believe him, but to their cost. After testing him repeatedly for toxoplasmosis because he has a pet 22-year-old cat, he proves to have syphilis instead. The story doesn't outright call him a liar, but there's a strong implication that he must have lied about not having sex and probably about not having sex with men. After repeated questioning, this patient, quote, reported that between 1 and 2 years ago he had had a sexual contact he had not mentioned in previous interviews. Clearly, just wrong, right? We often hear whether a patient is married, monogamous, or sexually active, or not sexually active, or sexually active using condoms, or Sexually active with multiple female partners. The measles patient is sexually active with multiple female partners. What does that mean? He's 21 years old, and technically that means he's had more than one sexual partner in his life. And yet clearly this is supposed to be dire information. This is very important, critical information about his history. The patient also smokes, uses drugs, lives with his mother, and works in a food processing factory, so he's far from the normative patient. The discussant's initial differential diagnosis includes HIV and syphilis, but this turns out to be incorrect. He has measles, which the discussant actually fails to guess. Syphilis would be much more consistent with the portrait of this patient's character that the story portrays. In a similar case, a patient with Native American ancestry lives with roommates, drinks, smokes marijuana, and has a history of chlamydia, and has been sexually active with multiple partners in the last year. Oh no, right? That is, this 25-year-old man has had more than one partner in a year. Sexually transmitted diseases are the first items considered in the differential diagnosis, especially syphilis, but he proves to have a rare autoimmune disease more common in East Asians. The case records don't always prove that bad behavior leads to medical disaster. Some seem to caution against such simplistic interpretations, but character and morality is always in the background. Some patients do everything right, while some obviously do not. Much more sympathetic than these last patients I described is a young 27-year-old monogamous married woman, a chemical engineer, and this is our ideal patient, by the way, okay, who proves to have chikungunya virus acquired on her honeymoon trip to the Caribbean. Her race is not identified in the story, but a picture of her rash, as you can see here, shows white European ancestry for this patient. They have to remove her wedding ring because of the swelling in her hands. Although they distrust her profession of monogamy enough to test her for HIV, she proves innocent, and there is a substantial discussion of the depression and mental suffering she endured during her long recovery from the virus. This physician's really like this patient. She's very sympathetic. She speaks herself at the conference, describing her state of mind during her illness, and here's what she says. This can't happen to me. I'm young, I'm healthy, I exercise 5 or 6 times a week, I eat healthy, I floss every day, I'm a pretty happy person. I was a newlywed, my husband and I had just bought our own house, and I had a job that I took a lot of pride in, and then all of a sudden I was miserable. Clearly, she's a very sympathetic character like Galen's gymnastic youth, though the qualities are different. Like Galen's patient, she's young, but in other respects she conforms to a different picture of virtue. She's married, chipper, eats right, exercises, owns her own home, and is sexually monogamous. The theme of her recent marriage, by the way, comes up so often in this story. They have to cut off her wedding ring, she's home from her honeymoon, and so on. So this is, and everything she says is like, you're not supposed to get sick if you're that kind of person. So how could this happen to me? Well, you shouldn't have gone to the Caribbean. That's the answer, right? Okay, likewise, the patient in your handout is, I thought about using her for your handout, but I picked a different one for your handout. She's a sort of model patient. She's young, she's just 18 years old, she lives with her family, she goes to high school, she doesn't drink, take drugs, smoke, or even travel. The pictures show a lovely young white woman. Her sexual history isn't even mentioned in the social information, as if it could not possibly be relevant. But we find out later that she's a virgin. She has, quote, no history of sexual activity that would make us doubt the negative HIV test that they give her anyway. We apparently have no trouble believing this patient, although young people are sometimes presumed in the stories to be sexually active or promiscuous, as in the case of a 15-year-old girl from the Dominican Republic with hyperthyroid condition who is tested repeatedly for pregnancy. So it's my impression, anyway, that young white middle-class patients are more sympathetically portrayed in the stories, like the young honeymooner or the virgin. In the case of a young white male college student with catastrophic cardiac symptoms, again, I'm saying that he's white because there's a picture of his skin. Despite that he is sexually active, occasionally smokes pot, and lives with roommates, just like the Native American, right? Sexually transmitted diseases are never in the differential diagnosis, and he's not repeatedly interrogated and tested about his sexual history. In that patient, the illness is not connected with his identity in a way that it is for some of our less fortunate protagonists. He turns out to have a rare inflammatory autoimmune disease. This is also true of the virgin in your story. She's not completely normative. She's only 18, and that's a little too young. So there's a moment where the discussant considers bulimia nervosa in her differential diagnosis. which would be, again, a condition, typical. She's young, she's adolescent. She doesn't quite make it into that category of neoniscus, what Galen's category. However, this is dismissed right away in her case. As a general pattern, if you're a foreigner, if you're non-white, if you have exotic ancestry or bad habits, if you're poor or homeless, then your disease is about who you are. If you are a middle-class white person with no bad habits, your disease is just something that happens to you. Your sexual history in particular is assumed to be more pristine or at least more benign than that of people with other ethnic backgrounds or from lower classes. You're innocent, and the innocent patient is the ideal patient in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I think this last point partly explains the emphasis on young patients in the case records. If you're young, you're innocent, you can be innocent, but if you're old, you kind of can't be. Of course, you're going to have a ton of problems just by virtue of being old. Old patients can't be innocent in the same way. This is one area, by the way, where the case records has not responded to criticism. In the most places, they've been very responsive to criticism, but not on this point. In 2009, geriatrician Timo Strandberg of Finland wrote to complain that hardly any patients in the series are old. He calculated that the median age of patients in 2007 was 47, but that has not improved recently, and the median age of patients in my sample was 10 years younger at 37. Of the 52 cases, only 13 were over 60, only 4 were over 70. And in one of the oldest patients, a 78-year-old widow, the moral is actually a sort of interesting play on the identity theme. That is, her doctors presume that she has cancer because she's old. They actually call this the presumptive diagnosis in the story. But in fact, she has histoplasmosis because she's from South America. So that actually trumps the oldness problem. So the moral here is just because you're old, it doesn't necessarily mean you have cancer. You might well have something that responds easily to treatment, but cancer is always in the background, like syphilis and HIV for sexually active patients. So far I've been talking about patient identity. I could go on about that all day, and actually I'm going to have to skip this next part, I think, because I have gone on too long. I was going to talk about, and this next theme is a little bit complicated to explain. I was going to show, so I'll just summarize. I was going to show, oh, I'm done, that the NEJM stories seem to be deliberately non-agonistic and non-competitive. Galen's stories are obviously really competitive. They're about how he shows up a bunch of rivals and, cures the patient or makes the diagnosis or does whatever that nobody else could do. The NEJM stories seem to be deliberately avoiding that. They try to show that all the doctors are on the same page. In almost all the stories, the clinical diagnosis, the discussant's diagnosis, and the pathologist's diagnosis are always the same. That is, all the doctors agree on a diagnosis. If you are a doctor, by the way, this will strike you as miraculous. Week after week, all 3 physicians agree on a diagnosis for a patient. There's this sort of portrayal of unity in the medical profession. However, reading the chronological structure of the stories, if you read it very carefully, you can see that the MGH is the hero of the stories. It's not an individual person or an individual doctor that saves the patient. It's the hospital that does. And the whole story is structured around the hospital's intervention and salvation. In this case, salvation is just diagnosis. The patients often die. But the whole point is the patient has finally arrived at MGH where they can get the correct diagnosis. And if you compare the 2 stories, you'll see that if you think of Galen and MGH are really playing very similar roles in the 2 stories. So that's, if you're motivated, you can investigate that, but I'm not going to bore you too much with that argument today. So anyway, to answer a question, I'm often asked this question. In fact, I was asked it most memorably by the president of a small liberal arts college at a job interview, and he asked me, "Are the Romans like us?" And I was so shocked because this is a really intelligent question, and I hadn't expected it from a college president. So I didn't know what to answer. But just in general, you probably don't know, but Roman historians usually take a position: are the Romans like us, or are they not like us? And I'm sort of more of a Romans are not like us kind of person. But in any case, the answer to the question that I wish I'd given is it's not that the Romans are like us, it's that we're like them, right? It's obvious that Galen's case histories and the NEJM case histories are really different. We don't really need to discuss that. But what's more interesting is that when we read Galen, we read it very carefully and see the patterns, we learn something about ourselves that we didn't see before. We're a lot more, the NEJM case histories are a lot more like Galen's case histories than they appear to be at first. And in particular, they suggest how deeply moral factors and agonistic ideas influence the modern medical profession more than we might have thought. Thank you. Again, thanks for coming.